Welcome here. I'm delighted to see so many here today, and we have, I think, more than 350 registered online today. So let me say a few words about the UN Talks seminar series. This is a seminar series that is co-hosted by UNDP Sweden and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. And this is actually the first one after the COVID period, the first one where we can in person also meet each other. So I'm very happy to welcome you back and thank you for staying engaged. The purpose of the UN Talk series is really to deepen our understanding of the UN's unique role with the focus on the Swedish audience, and also deepen our partnership engagement. Sometimes, very often, when we engage in New York, we all like to say we are the UN together. When we get out in countries or in projects, we sometimes are busy differentiating ourselves from each other and fragmentizing the fabric of the UN. So I'm incredibly happy that we together have a panel where the UN and the civil society and member states are present. Let me just take a few words on the position of today's seminar. A personal reflection is, I think more than ever, each of us wake up in the morning and go to bed in the evening feeling distress. There is real need to counter the dire situation in the world, in all its places, and bring about hope and action. Today's talk is about promoting critical reflection and deeper understanding of how we work, and more specifically, how UN works in complex conflict settings, and to explore the unique set of challenges, often characterized by political and humanitarian and development crises at the same time, sometimes with high levels of violence and the absence of functioning public institutions. So these settings require significant amount of assistance, but also of collaboration, of relevant strategies, adhering to the principles of saving lives in the short perspective and building livelihoods and societies' ownership in the longer perspective. And that is really a big challenge. In the next hour and 15-20 minutes, we will hear the panelists discuss from their different viewpoints the expectations, but also the insights of how the UN, as our common institution, can contribute meaningfully and effectively. So let me now, without further ado, turn to our panelists. And I will start with you, Kani. It's a real pleasure to introducing you. As I said, Assistant Secretary General and the UNDP Director for the Regional Bureau for Asia. My previous boss when I was in the UN, but also a resident coordinator in Zambia. So you've been on the ground and in headquarters, and I know you are always busy traveling mentally and practically between reality and policy. So turning to you, Kani, how does the UN response respond to crises like Myanmar and Afghanistan, and what factors need to be in place to have an effective and efficient response in those settings. And that's going beyond jargon. So let's have an honest talk. Over to you, Kenny.
Thank you very much, Per. And let me say that I have played many roles in the UN in my career. So I will be speaking first as UN and then also as UNDP. And to say, I think with everything we say and do today in what I would call uniquely unsettling times. And I think in a period when we see a war, multiple crises around the world, compounded by the competition around our natural assets and a rapidly deteriorating climate, that with pandemics, and we've just seen one in our immediate times now, this is not the end of it. I think you will always be seeing the breakdowns for as long as there are people on this planet. That social contract between each other, between us and nature, will keep breaking down. And in order to avoid that, we have to keep investing and reinvesting in peace and development. So for those who say that, oh, we're done with investing in peace in this situation, or we're done with development in that situation, I would question that very, very fundamentally. I think we've got to address the massive deficits in what people have lost, staggering losses in recent times. And we've got to do it with everything we've got. We cannot say, well, I've got a set of relief instruments, so let me come in and provide a humanitarian aid response. Because that is a must when there is a very acute need in the weeks and months that follow that immediate break, but not sequentially, but at the same time, one has to invest back in building back the peace and building back development. So I think the international community response, I have to say, and that includes us as a UN, has not actually been able to yet fully balance these out. We still tend to do stop and go. We are still looking at, we suspend and freeze development support, and we move forward just on one foot, if you wish, or with sometimes both hands tied behind our back. And then we scratch our heads and we're very sad at the ballooning costs of the humanitarian caseload. Our humanitarian entities, both in the UN and in NGOs, are the first to say that it's a staggering cost. And we repeat it year after year after year. So the question to me always is, how before we start calling it a protracted crisis, do we come in and stop a protracted relief operation by bringing in all the instruments at our disposal to really address this, and fundamentally to look at local communities. Local economies, stabilize them fast. Local community resilience, we've seen this in countries. Look at Myanmar and Afghanistan, many other places. Look at Ukraine, the resilience of people and their capabilities, I think, have to be invested in and continuously invested in, because that's where change comes from. And fundamentally, I feel that it's about creating livelihoods. Because no matter what your ethnicity or your nationality, your geography, your political ideology, would you not prefer to have your own sense of agency, to be able to make choices about who you want to be, your identity, what you want to eat, what you want to grow, what you want to sell and buy, how you want to protect your family, and yes, then the systems around that support you to do that. Is that not what we owe people, particularly in these really, really tough situations. And that comes from those investments that come in at the same time as a humanitarian relief response that come in with development and peace investments. We owe it to our brothers and sisters, I feel, very much on this. And the standard bearer for this, I find, is the rights and the access and identity of women and girls. The more and more we can invest in women's space to learn, to earn, to protect their families, we see the sea change at the local levels. So when people tell me, oh, it was 20 years wasted investment in Afghanistan or in Myanmar, I say, you gotta be kidding. Just look at the resilience in these countries. Look at what local communities are doing. Look at ways in which they're finding ways to get on with their lives. And as they've done before, it is this social capital that will transform their countries. We can help, we must support, but I think we've got to bring all of it together to do so. So maybe, Pearl, let me close my initial reflections by saying that at the end of the day, it's that building of local institutions and local capability, not just to withstand, but to anticipate and get ahead. And we have the instruments. We can work in countries where member states do not recognize or legitimize a state authority. We have all the instruments to work in these situations. So let's please bring them all to bear to make it better for people in countries like Afghanistan, Myanmar, Syria, Yemen. I can go on. The list, sadly, is a long one. And now Ukraine. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Kani. People, livelihoods, promoting ownership in situations even when government is compromised, and attending both the humanitarian catastrophe and long-term resilience building are points you raise, and we will come back to them in the course of the talk. Now, I'm going to turn over in a second to Mikkel Hjelmåker, who is the Deputy Director in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs UN Department. But in between the UN and the government is actually the best part to introduce myself, because the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, which I represent, is 60 years this year. Founded by the Swedish Parliament and recognized in a General Assembly resolution in the legacy of the second Secretary General, stands for a principled leadership, a UN which is not only for the big guys, but for all member states, very much looking at the legitimacy of working through the weakest in the chain to build a global society which is of respect to all of us. So I'm Per Knudsen, I'm the Deputy Executive Director and one of two Program Director, and I'm very happy to be your moderator here today. Mikkel Hjelmåker then, representing a member state, listening to Kani's introductory remark, how do you see a member state of the UN as Sweden enabling a coherent and efficient UN with integrity in situations that are highly compromised, as Afghanistan, as Myanmar, as Ukraine, etc.?
Thank you, Per, and thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. It's a great honor to share the stage with these eminent colleagues. Yeah, the challenges are immense, and I think Kani just gave us a very broad outline of the situations we face. Unfortunately, we know that these types of crises are increasing in number. We've seen latest today was the newest data from the WFP announcing how the challenge with food security is peaking. beyond what we've ever seen before. It's just one of the signs. The basic premise, of course, to answering your question, Per, is that, and the one that the Swedish government holds very dear, is that we want to see a strong UN at the center of joint multilateral solutions to the challenges that we face today. And I would just divide them up really into two, of how Sweden as one member state can hopefully be of assistance and also be a bit of a push on the UN once in a while when it might be needed. So I would say that there are two tracks. One would be political, one would be financial. And of course, they're closely related. On the political side, in all decision-making bodies, including the Security Council, the executive boards of the UN agencies, etc., in all of those decision-making bodies, Sweden, together with many other countries, we need to be consistent in arguing for a strong role for the UN. And when we have views on it, pointing to what that role is, meaning what services we expect the UN to deliver in various settings. But to have clear mandates and also sufficient resources for the UN to do the job that we ask of it to do. Everything falls without adequate resources and without adequate support. Nothing will be done. We know that. Secondly, I would say our role as a member state is to, and we are, I would say we're getting better. We're certainly not there yet as an international community, but we need to act coherently. We need to ask clearly of what we ask the UN to do, recognizing that the UN is not the only player on the ground. We also have the World Bank, we have the regional development banks, we have the EU, we have civil society organizations, not least. And to be very clear in how we are promoting coherence and coordination in efforts, especially in these settings, such as the ones we're talking about today, where the situation can be very fluid from day to day. On the financial side, I would say, and this is critical, we need to do our share in resourcing the UN. The UN will only be as good as its membership wants. I would say we, the member states, are really the weakest link of the UN system. That might be seen as controversial, but I have said it for a long time and I still hold it to be true. If we member states don't want the UN to succeed, we simply don't fund it. And that's what we're seeing in too many places today. Sweden holds dear to our heart that we believe the UN needs to be very flexibly and predictably funded. When a crisis erupts, be it in Afghanistan or be it now in Ukraine, we have seen how the UN, individual UN agencies have been able to redirect their efforts and act very quickly in some cases to respond to those needs that have arisen. This can only be done if the UN has those types of financial resources. And this is why Sweden is funding a number, 9 actually, UN agencies with multiple year core funding. And we're very happy about this, and we take great pride in it. And we constantly urge other donor countries to do the same, increasingly. Sadly, what we've seen the last 3 years, and this just came out actually, is that the core funding is decreasing, not the way we need to move. And in addition to this, we need to be a responsible humanitarian donor. When the needs arise, and they will. Right now, it's mostly Ukraine, it was Afghanistan in the fall. We know there are many others, and there will unfortunately come more such situations. Then we need to step up and be able to respond to those situations, just like Kani said. I think I'll stop there, Pelle, for now.
Thank you, Michael. I'm turning to you now, Petra. Representing an organization as Kvinna till Kvinna, I believe you will have your 30th anniversary next year. Coming out of the darkest and most difficult situations in Bosnian war, where rape was systematized warfare, becoming a small interest-driven human rights-based organization to today being active in more than 20 countries and catalyzing social fabric, civil society. what's your perspective then on your role in these not only emerging but existing conflict, where we need to do more than just piecemeal imprints, but actually contribute to transformational change in collaboration with the UN and the larger development family? So over to you, Petra.
Yes, so many thoughts right now, so many interesting things that you said that I would like to comment on, but we have some minutes left, so we'll get there. So as you said, right now we work in 20 conflict affected countries with over 150 local women's organizations. We are definitely present in humanitarian context, in crisis and in conflict, but we are constantly keeping the eye on the long-term prize, as you've mentioned, working for long-term peace, for resilient societies, for human rights, and particularly then for women's rights, but also for LGBTQ rights. And I think it's extremely, I mean, it's okay, where to start? In our business, we a lot talk about the nexus. And I see, you know, the nexus between humanitarian, long-term and peace building, but also then the nexus, as you mentioned, between all of these different actors. And we come and go. Kvinna till Kvinna doesn't go as much. We're still in the Western Balkans, and we usually stay quite long and try to work on this, you know, the core support of both being there long-term, but also funding long-term. But as you mentioned, you know, the conflicts arise and we focus our attention. The actors that don't come and go are the local civil society organizations, the women's rights organizations. They are there before the conflict breaks out, which means that they are always the first responders. And we see this over and over again, regardless if it's Ebola, when that outbreak happened, it happened during COVID. We'd see it when conflicts arises in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, and we see it in Gaza from time to time, and now the most recent example, Ukraine. And I think that role that the local civil society organization have is something that we as actors in these settings, in this crisis setting, need to pay more attention to. Because when we talk to our partners about the nexus, they don't talk about a nexus. They talk about their everyday reality. They don't divide their attention or the resources saying, okay, today I'm doing an advocacy work. That means I'm working on long-term development. Tomorrow I'll be on the peace building track, but then in the afternoon, I will be a humanitarian actor. They don't work like that. And us putting these labels and different strategies, which for many reasons are understandable because we need to sort out our world and structure it, but it's really making it harder for the true peace builders, the true humanitarian actors, the ones that will bring this resilience and the long-term development. And I think as Kvinna till Kvinna, being an international NGO, having the access to these conversations, standing on this stage, being able to have these conversations, but also then being with one foot. I really don't like the expression on the ground, but being with one foot in the countries or the context where things are going on, I think that we have a really important role in saying the uncomfortable things, but always wanting to collaborate and work together, being that critical voice, but always with the intention of contributing.
Add a tag-on question just there, Petra. Against that background that you and your role, what's your experience in collaborating with the UN, and what would you expect in order for your mandate and work to be reinforced in collaboration with the UN? Could you say something about that?
Yes, I think Kvinna till Kvinna, as an international NGO, we have our experience of working with the UN, which is different in some ways from our partners' experience from working with the UN. And that also depends quite a lot on in which country, because it can be very specific. And as we all know, that could actually be due to the, the individuals that are in that specific setting. But in general, I would say that working with the UN is important, but in many cases a rather delicate issue, because the UN does a lot of good things, but the UN are also, and if I really speak from my perspective, working with women's rights organizations, they are very often in contact with UN women. And I think that UN Women plays an enormously important role in the UN system of always having the gender perspective, always bringing in women's rights. However, what we see on country level is that UN Women and the sometimes very strong local women's organizations, they might not do the exact same analysis. They might actually clash with each other. And I think it's natural that it happens. And I don't really see that there's no point in saying the UN women shouldn't be there. UN women should be there, but it's really important to listen and to have this dialogue. And maybe also the UN need to think about who is really behind the steering wheel here. Should it be the local women's organization and that, UN women should support? That's the role that Kvinna till Kvinna is taking. We are never behind the wheel. We're the ones supporting them so that they can do their analysis. But so other than that, I think it's really important that women are consulted. And I can talk more about that later. I think Sweden has had some really excellent examples of that when or during the Security Council period, and also making sure that that was long-term. And then it's been mentioned, financial support to make sure that it's flexible and that it's the core support that you've all mentioned. And yeah, I can get back to that as well, when we talk about costs and the question of where do we get the money, because a topic that I think is always almost absent from this conversation is, so what is it that we are spending? What are member states spending money on? And we don't talk about disarmament, and we don't talk about the cost of militarization. So if we could go back to that, I would be very excited, but we'll see.
Thank you, Petra. So now the turn has come to you, Per Karlsson, Head of Development Cooperation for Afghanistan. The embassy is located still in Stockholm. Previously, you were heading the development cooperation to Somalia as well. So you have experience from several fragile contexts. Looking at the situation, not only in Afghanistan, but in those contexts, representing both the bilateral aid through SIDA into the multilateral system, and also being part of the core support that Michael spoke to. Where do you see the greatest challenges in current situations on how to combine and optimize resources, to intelligently integrate efforts, to make use of taxpayers' resources in a way where we can actually contribute to the lives and livelihoods of people in effective ways in these crisis situations?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Per, and thanks also for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, I think there are numerous critical challenges in combining the two types of funding, as you've said, and just in general in leading an effective and contributing to an effective multilateral response in this kind of context. Because first of all, the context themselves present such a myriad of challenges, which you yourself alluded to in the beginning: the violent conflicts, the humanitarian crisis, political instability, crumbling institutions, etc., decaying physical and social infrastructure. So apart from the human tragedy, these characteristics also present an extremely difficult operating environment for any kind of intervention, but especially so, of course, for large-scale humanitarian development and peace-building engagements, such as UN engagement in these countries. But we all know that it is in these types of contexts that our joint dedication is most needed. 75% of all people living in extreme poverty these days are found in fragile contexts. So the conversation we're having here couldn't be more urgent or relevant. Now, you may not be surprised to trying to answer your question that one of the most critical challenges to sort of an effective international response, drawing on the various funding streams you mentioned, is effective coordination. And I think in situations of conflict and dire humanitarian need, and also when we risk seeing aid budgets shrinking further, it becomes even more important that we use our joint resources effectively and strategically. And coordination becomes even more urgent when governments lack the capacity to lead, or which Kanye alluded to, when we, or a large part of the international community, cannot engage with de facto authorities, such as is the case in Afghanistan. When I speak about coordination, it covers indeed all the aspects that many of the previous speakers have noted, within the donor community, of course, but also within the UN family, and vis-a-vis the UN and the World Bank and other financial institutions, just like Michael mentioned earlier. And this is also very visibly from sort of my horizon in Kabul previously, and now from capital levels, but still having sort of been part of the Kabul, the international community that should be in Kabul. So in this kind of situation, as we have in Afghanistan right now, the heavy responsibility of leading coordination falls obviously and naturally on UN. And turning specifically to Afghanistan, we're very delighted that the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, was given a very strong mandate by the Security Council in not only monitoring and leading advocacy on issues of peace building, human rights, and the rights of women and girls, but also for coordination of both humanitarian and development aid. But I think the UN's leadership in Afghanistan became visibly actually already immediately after the 15th of August, when the Taliban assumed power. And I think since then, during the autumn and the first half of this year, the UN family has really managed to live up to its intention of, quote, staying and delivering. And just to give a couple of very notable examples of this, the UN country team managed to quite rapidly develop a very useful transitional engagement framework that became a guiding document around which all UN organs, and indeed World Bank and international NGOs as well, could sort of align their development efforts. This, of course, is a short-term document, but it provided what was extremely valuable in what we hope will be a transitional phase. Secondly, also UNDP established this very quickly the Special Trust Fund for Afghanistan, and that could pool UN funding for UN resources, and particularly for what was called Abadei, a local word in Dari. That means, I believe, community resilience, basically. And this is indeed exactly the kind of program that Kani highlighted the need for earlier. It is an area-based, sort of bottom-up program with tailor-made solutions that will address basic needs and local livelihoods and the community level, and also to complement the humanitarian support. So here I really want to recognize the leadership and enormous, indefatigable work of both the resident coordinator and humanitarian Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov, as well as UNDP Country Director Abdallah Al-Dardari. And I recently visited again for the first time since 15th of August, Kabul, as well as Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. And I was happy to see firsthand that the Special Trust Fund is already fulfilling its promise of promoting the goal of delivering as one, this very ambitious goal of the ongoing UN reforms. In Kandahar, UN staff was quite enthusiastically working hard to realize the synergy gains that should come from such a joint approach, leading to increased results for the Afghan people, of course. And I'm very happy also to note promoted a very strong community ownership and engage the local actors that I think, Petra, you did so well in highlighting. And the STFA furthermore also draws on lessons learned from other fragile contexts, which we're very happy to note, including making use of a similar risk management arrangement, which I think was pioneered in Somalia or perhaps other contexts. With regard to how donors can, sort of at the Kabul level, embassies and donor missions, which at least should be in the country, how we can best enable the UN to meet these challenges, I think I'm very happy to say that we are very coordinated, very well coordinated with Michael. Without having done any prior coordination, we're at least very, I promise you that, we're still very coherent, because the two issues that I mentioned was predictable and flexible funding, the funding support, but also really to promote support in the wider sense, and perhaps, as you said, Michael, political sense, to advocate for the UN to be given that space, that mandate, that opportunity, that platform to take on that leadership role. And in that sense also, we're very happy and honored to become the first donor co-chair of the Special Trust Fund for Afghanistan, which position we'll use to facilitate improved engagement between the donor community and the UN, as well as to advise on the strategic direction of the fund going forward.
Thank you, Per. And now we have heard all the interventions from a role perspective, relating from your roles to the role of the UN, but also independently on your comparative advantage. And Kenny, you said in an earlier conversation today, there is no equation between development and development cooperation. Development belongs to us all, and it happens all the time. And development cooperation through using public funds, but with specific mandates, can contribute to that development more or less meaningfully. So let's go into the really hard questions now. And I'm not expecting you to have all the answers, but these are questions we need to confront. And I will start with you, Kenny, again, but I will also list the questions, so maybe we can have a conversation touching across the questions. But with the unique role of the UN, you're expected to engage, to be on the ground, to be our collective outfit. How do you then maneuver in between promoting local ownership and integrity at the same time, when you're in situations where government is compromised or citizens are suffering from deficient governance? So I will start with that question with you, but I also want to upfront say that I will turn to Petra for us to gain a bit of understanding that in these situations when young persons or women men, let alone old ones as well, are left to fight a battle for all of us, but they cannot be accountable to protocol or auditing principles. So what do they need in terms of flexible response to be able to continue engaging? And I will also turn back to you, Per, on that very same question, that if development in a coordinated way is also about sharing risk in order to not give up in the most difficult situation, how do we promote young peace builders, women and men, even under the umbrella of the UN, so that they can access support and resources where very little of institutional capacity exists? And of course, in that story, the UN can promote flexibility and space for that to happen. So if you have comments on that. At the end, before letting the audience in, I will also turn to Michael with a reflection, again, from a member state point of view, that what is the leadership that you expect from the UN? What are the critical dimensions of this that you as Sweden want to send signals to the UN about? But coming back to how do you promote actually ownership and integrity in such situations?
Thanks, Per. I would say, we're working in a number of countries in the world, but certainly let me speak to the region I cover. And if I look at the work we're doing in Afghanistan and in Myanmar, both countries with governments not recognized and very difficult space for the citizens of these two countries. To me, the ownership, the integrity, the trust is built with people. We recognize people. We do not have to recognize, as member states, the governments. But I have always felt that who am I to not recognize the rights, the identity, the needs, let's say, of that woman who wants to open her business, that girl who wants to go to school, because I, as a member state, don't recognize her government. So it's very important that we separate out the work that we all can do, including the UN family, directly with and for people who we recognize. We recognize their agency. And I think this is where we have to then say, as a UN, we also need to stay engaged with the de facto authorities of these countries. We have to continue that conversation to make sure there is a path that opens up the space for people in that country to have the freedoms, to have the rights to development, to grow, and to just have that sense of space to make your own choices and create your own opportunities. I used to have this tussle with, I remember with Amartya Sen and Mahbubul Haq when they came with UNDP to put forward the concept of human development. And the tussle that many of us, young first-timers in the UN at the time, is we felt that even more in that concept, there should be a double D, one for development and one for dignity, that you invest and you protect and you promote a people's sense of dignity. So I think that local ownership and integrity is very much something that we have to keep. We have to keep the eye on the ball there and make sure that that type of social capital doesn't get eroded. And it does, because when there's so much despair and anxiety and fear, it tends to eat away at this. And yet, if you ask all our surveys in these communities, in some of the toughest, poorest communities that are going through violence, if you ask them, what is it that you care about most? it is issues around dignity, justice, fairness, rights. It's not poverty, food, water, etc. So yes, those are there for physical life, but human beings, no matter your nationality, your ethnicity, your religion, fundamentally, I think that is what we've got to serve first. So my last word on that, and we had an amazing conversation with a group of human rights organizations and CSOs just before coming here. And they also reminded us that what's very important for entities like us at the UN is that we have to fast adjust our, let me call them, protocols and procedures that allow us to work across the spectrum of everything we bring, which is absolutely possible. We all have the tools. Sometimes the politics may not allow us, or the financing may not allow us to apply them all at the same time. So my plea is that we adjust, and please push us to adapt and adjust fast, but let me also push back to our member states to say, do allow us to bring all our instruments and capabilities to bear, and don't just choose a small part of the UN and say that's all you can do in a situation like that, because that is not, as Petra said, how people live their lives.
Thank you, Kenny. If you take the starting point in the twin resolution on building and sustaining peace, member states and the UN has committed to going for the root causes and also engaging the critical key actors of not only conflict, but building and sustaining peace. So in dire situations and extreme fragility, what does it take then for official development assistance to reach those actors? And how do you play that role in Kvinna till Kvinna? And how do you see the larger UN coordination framework being able to foster, promote, and safeguard that kind of flexibility? But start with your own role.
Big questions. Well, I think if I may just, how Kvinna till Kvinna started, because we were then very present during the Balkan Wars in the refugee camps, supporting women. And very early on, we knew that, okay, we do not need to come here and build a project or decide what someone should do. There's so many women here. They have already organized. They have a vision. They have an agenda. Let's support that. And I think, as I told some of you yesterday, that the reason why we were able to do that so quick and in the flexible way was because we had the trust of SIDA. This was in the 90s. I know that this was before new public management, but on this page, we wrote what we wanted to do, and then we turned it over and we wrote a budget. Maybe a little exaggerated, and it's a good story internally, but still. And then this is what we want to do. And that SIDA gave that trust to us, we could give that trust to the ones with the local knowledge, as we've been talking about, the local community. And today we have a lot of conversation about this, letting go of the control agenda, moving over to a trust agenda. But in my opinion, there's some sense of that this should mean increased risk, because then working with actors, as you say, that we, maybe we can't hold them accountable in the same way. They don't have the structures that we used to. I would say that going from control to trust would lead to higher risk. I think that's wrong. I think that it's, the opposite. And one of the reasons why I think that, it's not increased risk of, supporting all of these actors that are there, because the money at this moment, and I would of course like to increase that funding, but I mean, the amount of funding we're talking about, it's pretty much, I would imagine it's what UN, spend on representation and lunches and coffee breaks. Let's assume they say there were around 740 feminist civil society organizations in the world. They have the combined budget, 740 organizations, of one fighter jet. Sweden has 134 fighter jets. I mean, the money that we're talking about when it comes to these local organizations, they do so much with so little money. So it's not a financially risky business for international community to put more funding, to increase the funding. We know that for the bilateral budget that goes to conflict affected countries, only 0.2 goes directly to local women's rights organization. So I think that sort of risk factor we can take away. And then I also think that, you know, supporting these actors is also with low risk, because they all work, and you all know this, and you probably all know this in the audience, they work for their lives. It's their survival that's at stake. It's their dignity. It's their children's future. But then if we let go of those 2 points, I think also a very concrete way of working with this is by being present. And because that would also then, if you're afraid of corruption or if you're afraid of money disappearing, well, by being present in the countries and working together, as we do with Kvinna till Kvinna, you know, we are part of the women's movement. We see each other as partner and we exchange experiences. And on your question, how the UN can provide this, I know that a lot of UN funding, a lot of the different institutions, they channel money to civil society. And I think, you know, to continue to do that, and also always then being aware of what kind of demands do we put on these local society when it comes to reporting and when it comes to funding proposal. And I mean, when it comes to that, I will hold that mirror up against in front of me as well, because we are also, you know, a donor to a lot of partners, and we are constantly reflecting on how can we make this process easier. And we are constantly being critiqued by our partners that we are too complicated. And then we turn around and tell CEDA, you know, you guys make us too complicated. So, you know, we're all part of this. And I'm not in any way saying that international NGOs such as Kvinna till Kvinna is, you know, free from blame. We are part of this, and we need to work together on making it simpler for the ones that are actually the actors, who should be the actors in charge.
Thank you, Petra. And with that, Per, given that in the most difficult situations, it's those who did not leave the country who are risking their lives daily to continue development from different viewpoints, who needs to repurpose their work or adapt their work more or less on a weekly or monthly basis to contribute. How can you, and how do you as a representative of CEDA in the embassy for Afghanistan promote flexible instruments in your financing to the UN, and how do you engage in that dialogue so that there is not only the long-term institutional support, but there is also an innovative investment in making it possible for that type of social capital not to be lost as situations deteriorate?
Thanks, Per. That's a burning issue in Afghanistan. As we all know, there has been, I think, over 100,000 Afghans who have left the country since the 15th of October. And this has in many ways been, those have been associated with the Western embassies and contractors, etc. But it has also been not the whole, but large part of an entire generation of civil society leaders and human rights defenders and women's leaders for women's rights organizations, female judges, female police officers, female lawyers. So this is really one of the fundamental issues we have to start addressing. Before the 15th of August, I was involved with a very innovative EU-funded project that Sweden and Folke Bernadotte SIDA and Folke Bernadotte Academy is implementing, the Afghanistan Peace Support Mechanism. That tried to support, as you said, young peace builders during that time when there was such a peace process at hand. And that, I think, one of the innovative aspects of it was that it allowed us to engage in the kind of very labor-intensive work of supporting small CBOs, small CSOs and organizations, something that embassies and SIDA rarely have the capacity and human resources to do. But I think, and I do hope that that particular program will continue with the EU funding, but now with a slightly different approach, but very much focused on civil society and dialogue with the de facto authorities. But we do have also a very close and continuous discussion with the UN on this. Both, of course, the human rights team within UNAMA and the rule of law team there as well, but also with the UN country team and UNDP. And I am happy to say that Abadei, the Arabist program I mentioned earlier, really has a very holistic approach and include also components that will promote social cohesion, as it's phrased. And among that is, for instance, human rights-based access to justice, gender equality, also as sort of programmatic outputs and immediate objectives to be met. So it's very it's an interesting prospect with Abadei to be able to do this kind of human rights work from below on a large scale in a place like Afghanistan today, given the very repressive and increasingly, unfortunately, repressive administration there. UN Women and UNFPA and others, I think also UNDP and the RCO are also have another very innovative approach. They are thinking of funding, giving very, very small grants to 10 women-led women's rights organizations in every of the 34 provinces, in all of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan. So that will provide many times sort of institutional life-saving for them in the access of almost close to 350 women's rights organizations. And these grants are intentionally kept at a very low level, so it will require a little of the bureaucracy that you referred to, Petra, that can be an obstacle. So I think this is another innovative way that the UN is really rising to the occasion. And then we're, of course, very supportive of this initiative as many donors. So I think this discussion continues. But what's so important in Afghanistan is that the UN is really, there are very few Western embassies. The EU delegation have a minimal diplomatic presence. But otherwise, if we discuss sort of viewing the situation with a rights-based perspective, UN, his addition to everything else, also our ears and eyes on the ground. So this is something we'll have to, and we look forward to continue discussing solutions with the UN.
Thank you, Per. Let's turn to you, Michael. I know you were part of negotiating the Agenda 2030, and from that followed member states' decisions on reforming the UN. And when you bring that down to the country level and to the realities of the UN's mandate, it's for the UN to make a conclusion between development aspirations and priorities in the locality and global norms and standards. And based on that, the new RC resident coordinator function is placed. I believe Sweden has been on the forefront in support of a new leadership profile, or invigorated leadership, I would say. Could you, based on what the discussion today, what is the expectations on the UN in advancing its leadership on different, and of course, as I said before, it's not for you to define, but to support some of the characteristics that are important to the government.
Thank you, Pelle. Yeah, I can be very brief if you want. What kind of leadership is a country like Sweden looking for? A good and effective one. But I can elaborate a bit more. You mentioned the UN reform process. I mean, this is something that has been going on for a long time. It's not the most exciting or easily accessible process for if you're looking at it from the outside. But what Connie would attest to, and she has more background in this than most people on this planet, is that there are huge steps that have been and are being taken in terms of how the UN operates and functions, especially then within the development and also humanitarian part of things. What we need is really leadership that has been envisaged in this reform process, and I think it also comes through when you look at the Secretary General's our common agenda and his vision for the multilateral system in the years to come. The resident coordinator and or the humanitarian coordinator, they are immensely important people at country level. I think we see that clearly, more clearly, as the number of fragile contexts increase. It becomes more and more visible how important that post is. We need to see a brave leadership from the UN at country level. A leadership that dares to push the envelope a little bit. There's always a risk, we know that, not only from bilaterals, but also for UN staff, of course. If you become too uncomfortable on certain issues in a certain country, there's a risk that you might get kicked out. But we need the UN reps, especially the RC and the humanitarian coordinator, to be there right at the front line. And to dare to call out not only government, but also to dare to call out donors when we misbehave, when we're not coordinating enough, or when we're not stepping up enough in regard to a certain situation. So we need to have that frankness, frank dialogue with the UN reps at country level. So what I think is, I mean, we all know the UN has big operations. We see UNICEF active, we see the World Food Program, those more operational actors. And then we have, of course, the UN's normative role, which we all know about, how the UN is a knowledge hub on many areas. But I would say at country level, one of the most unique features and most important features of the UN is its convening role. The UN holds a convening ability that no other actor has. And this is really the power of the resident coordinator, in my view. So to act smartly with the very limited resources that a resident coordinator has at his or her disposal, but to act smartly and to get that country team together and to plan jointly, to program jointly, to execute jointly when possible and when relevant. This is what we're looking for, especially in these situations where, as I think Per said, where the resources are the most scarce. We need to make such effective use of every crown or dollar that we possibly can. And agency mandates, of course, need to be clear and be the baseline for how that division of labor is established. One thing is for sure, and I can only speak on behalf of Sweden, but interagency competition for resources, we don't ever want to see it. It's the biggest turnoff for us as a donor that you can ever imagine. We don't have time and money for it. We are still seeing it. I think anybody working in this business, I guess it is. But sector, thank you, that's much better. This type of resource dwelling activity which takes place in the UN system and also between bilaterals to some extent, we don't have time for it. So most important, I would say, exactly who is appointed as resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator, because so much hinges on that one person, that person has the ability and the confidence and the knowledge to be able to execute that very difficult job, and that person can secondly promote integrated solutions, which, as has been alluded to by everyone, take in the humanitarian and the development perspective, because that is where we are still, of course, failing in all too many cases. Sorry if I went on too long.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now we can take 1, 2, 3 questions. I see Lennart over there. Can we have a microphone over to Lennart there? And please present yourself.
Hello, I'm Lennart Wolgemuth. I'm presently a guest professor in Gothenburg University on development cooperation issues. And I have researched a lot on particularly on ownership. And I think a number of very interesting points came out in this very short presentation, particularly the one you mentioned when you started. 20 years of work in Afghanistan is not wasted, you said. And I think this is probably one of the most important aspects of ownership. You have to work every day as if you have to leave next day. Unfortunately, as Per said, then the people where you had built up knowledge and capacities, they have left afterwards. So, I mean, it's not wasted, but it's not really comes back to the country. I think this is a very important issue. And I think that it has to sort of be the view in the work that you are doing. The second point I also want to raise is the issue on control and trust. We have had a period where trust has been more important, at least in Sweden, for quite some time now, and where the sort of control mechanisms that were built up under the result agenda that was slowly in diminishing. Unfortunately, with less money available and with the countries wanting to show their flags, we are back to more control again. I did a study for Forum Siv for all the NGOs in Sweden, and they were allowed to try out new ideas for quite some time. It's much more difficult today, and SIDA is back more on the control mechanisms again. And I think this probably will also be the relation between the donor community in the world and the UN. So I mean, we have the need for increasing liberties to, as you said, to experiment and to work with very difficult issues. And at the same time, you have a much more control from the donor society. And this is, of course, an additional problem that you have to live through. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Toboa Julius. I'm representing an organization here in Sweden called Newcomers to Sweden with Disability. It's a refugee-based organization. I have a few questions for the panelists. The first question is there a mechanism that the UN can use to overcome the state sovereignty in most conflict areas that the state doesn't want the UN to come in because they consider it as internal affair? I would take an example from my country of origin, Cameroon. We have an armed conflict going there for the past 5 years, and nobody wants to come in because it's been the government want it to be hidden and to be considered as internal affair. And most effort, they always use the principle of sovereignty to evade international community. How can you go about that? My second question also go with the responsibility to protect. It's rarely evoked in most cases. Why is that? Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. My name is Linn Jansson, and I'm currently working as program manager at the EU delegation to Yemen. And you were mentioned, so I'm working primarily with civil society support, and you've been talking about the importance of empowering local communities and different types of civil society organizations. But so I have 2 questions. The first one is how do you as the UN make sure to strengthen these local partnerships? Also in relation to what you, Per, said, that we see examples of many local, tiny, small civil society organizations receiving quite a lot of funding, not least within civil society support programs. It's quite a traditional approach to first do capacity building, training, and then give sub-grants. But is this really sustainable? Because as big donors, it will be hard for us to work directly with local populations if we only invest money in these small organizations. So do you have any examples of other types of actions? And also how about the resourcing? Of course, the UN never has enough money for doing everything and fulfilling all the needs. But at the same time, it can be sometimes a stick in the eye for local people to see that maybe 30% of an action goes into a UN body or any other international organization being implementing partner at this middle level before channeling funds into local civil society organizations, so that less part of the total funding reaches the final beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will do with those questions because they will even take us beyond time. I would also like to say to our listeners and viewers, participants on the web, that only because we have to end here, it doesn't mean that you can't send in questions that we will bring into our work and forward where they should go. There is a limit in time, but the work continues after this meeting. So maybe I start with you, Kani, and the question raised by my hearing was not good enough, but from the Association of Newcomers with Disabilities and our friend there, I think the question asked is, how can UN continue to engage in the most difficult situation while preserving some kind of principled leadership, integrity, and autonomy? And you addressed it a little bit before, but we had a discussion this morning where we referred to also that there are bilateral processes whereby governments are recognized or not, but there are also situations where the UN have to work in situations where government is more or less compromised and still maintain the principles of the Charter and other norms and standards. So would you like to say something about that, Kani?
Thank you, Per. Maybe let me also say thank you, Leonard, for those reflections. Really very much agree with that work and that perspective on ownership. Let me say in situations, whether in Cameroon or other locations, now the UN is a body of member states. So it is the Charter of the UN is very much based on recognizing state sovereignty. At the same time, we're very much, if you look at both the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions, the set of humanitarian principles that came out of that process of the scourge of war was indeed that not just the UN, but the partners, and with the partners of the UN, one should be able to have access to go in where people are suffering and need that support. Now, we can't send in people or support people where there is a active resistance and engagement to keep us out. At the end of the day, we cannot walk into countries. We still need, if there's a sovereign authority, we still need to be able to get that authority to allow us access. The world needs visas to go into many places. And so the issue of coming in We are not a military force. We do not invade. So it is a matter of engaging constantly, day by day. I think much of the world does not see the everyday difficult conversations that happen in various countries, but also globally and regionally, trying to access areas where people would absolutely want to see us there. And then that brings in the responsibility to protect clause. Now there it's interesting. If the Security Council cannot agree in it, the R2P can be taken to the General Assembly. But it is something that you are very right, that has been rarely used, because just think, you have 193 nations that have to agree to this. And today you can see the state of nations, if I might call it that, which makes it very difficult to activate what I find is one of the most powerful instruments, which is the responsibility to protect. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up on it or stop trying. So you see our SG constantly, and just because he's not always on the news talking about the responsibility to protect and the instrument does not mean that he or his predecessors, if I think of the second Secretary General of the UN from Sweden, this was, I think, foremost in his mind, and he probably lost his life for it. But this, I think, is the most powerful place to have those debates and negotiations, and we will keep going on to try and get to those populations that need us most.
Thank you, Kenny. And if I may just add on to you before I turn to the others, Lynn's question, which is very pertinent, that while we speak about coordinated and integrated approaches, how do we include civil society and the small scale initiative without fragmenting and diluting the impact, but rather mustering and combining forces? And could you speak to an example whereby UN is actually doing that?
Well, let me say on that, and thank you for that set of issues, very quickly to say that we have a range of instruments that we don't always put in place early enough. And I think the ability to adapt very quickly and use a mix of instruments. So with small organizations, one does not always have to go through those multiple steps and procedures to get to them. I am very much as I said before, of the view that people and those small organizations who live and breathe and wake up every day in those situations know their situations best. And if there's a way in which we can get to them a certain set of, whether it's specific digital and other tools that they've been asking us for in these situations, information that they may need, but very often direct cash that they know what to do with. Whether it's to individuals and households through a basic income instrument, or through revolving grants where you can set up your businesses and get on with your lives. I think we've got to step back from sometimes what has become the over architecture of some of these processes. I'm very much, when I see what's going on in a Myanmar and Afghanistan, and where we are seeing the light now, look at those local markets for food that have taken off. Look at the 55,000 micro businesses that are owned and run by women, who are now employing 5 to 7 other women, who go back to a household with income, on average, a 10 to 12 person household. That, to me, is what has generated local economic activity. And with that sense again that they're in control of their lives and are defining their futures. Now, that is still within a certain context, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working every day to open up that space on their rights, their right to learn, and the right to be also protected It's a matter of working at all these levels, but it's not for the lack of instruments or the lack of ingenuity. I think that political commitment to use the whole range of tools we have with us is the critical path we've got to follow at this time.
Thank you, Cam. We are soon coming to a close, but I would like to invite you to reflect on also Lennart's comments on local ownership in a more diversified way, as Kani has put it today. Is there also a policy gap, or are there efforts within SIDA, for instance, to look at how ownership is articulated in areas or context where government or formal ownership is not the immediate or the logical one? Per.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it really is I think an area where we should do continue to do more thinking also. But I think at SIDA we do have had, for instance, we are very much a lot of people, countries are discussing vis-a-vis Afghanistan the term development cooperation, and I think Kani mentioned this also in the initially. All development is development cooperation, because I think at SIDA and in Sweden generally we have always had the notion that the partnership and the cooperation need not be only with the government, the host government of the country. It may be with the broader society in that country as well, civil society, local communities, academia, etc. So I don't think, for instance, we still said we had development cooperation, for instance, with in Sudan under Omar al-Bashir, who was wanted by the International Criminal Court. But everybody knew that it was not with the government, and it was not through the state administration, but through UN and local NGOs and Swedish NGOs. So I think that we can and should be able to also continue in situations like Afghanistan and others, where we cannot have currently a diplomatic relationship and no direct engagement or dialogue. We can, and I believe we already are, through our partners such as the UN, we have mentioned a number of times, but also another very important NGO, the Swedish Afghanistan Committee, who is indeed working with local communities with a very bottom-up perspective in many parts of the countries. So I do think that while it would be interesting to think more sort of at conceptual level, but I do think that, or perhaps I should say, I would like to think that SIDA also have the sort of a open enough perspective to be able to support the initiatives that you mentioned, Kani, that will allow and promote ownership, even in this ownership of local communities, or over perhaps even, let's see, a local government, maybe even, and other grassroots institutions.
Can we have one or two last questions, if there are any? Yes, we have one in the back there.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a student at Uppsala University at the Peace and Conflict program. And I was thinking about how does the UN and other organizations such as Kvinna to Kvinna and other NGOs complicate complex conflict settings even more? Because there, as you said, it's a UN family. It's not only one organization, but it's built up by so many other organizations that have to cooperate, and there's a lot of things that I feel like that would complicate an already complex situation even more. So how do you handle that?
Yes, we have one. Yeah. Yeah, two more.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. I just wanted to ask a question following up on what Petra was talking about, which is the results that we see when we work at the very, very local level, which saves also the resources, on the resources in terms of money. How can we bring that even more to be more mainstream and be a measure of success for the UN organizations that are working in country? That's one question that I would like to ask. And the second question that I want to address is the question of dignity. We know that there's no dignity in getting your children fed by other people. And we know that there's no dignity in getting your people, if you are a leader of a local community or a leader of a country, getting their resources from another place, you know. So to the extent that it is possible, we need to address that question, which I think might be the root cause of accelerating conflict. That people at the local level feel that they are losing their dignity by having year after year humanitarian support, for whatever reason that may be.
My name is Janet Reben. I'm a transformation and health coach, and I've worked with female empowerment. And the question I have, I was very happy to hear how much has been done with women, because that's a very important part of having balance in our societies. But I wonder, how difficult is it in countries like Afghanistan to have men understand the resources that they have in their power, in their communities through the women? And why, how difficult would it be to help them understand this and appreciate it and put it into effect?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mustakim Wade. I currently work with the UN World Food Programme. Maybe just a quick two-part question. And one is regarding sort of the issue around sort of effectiveness of the UN in complex settings. Of course, the UN, I mean, is most effective perhaps when it has effective counterparts, particularly institutions that they can sort of take ownership, as we heard a little bit earlier, on some of their priorities. But how can the UN best support those efforts, perhaps, is one question. And then maybe a second question, and this sort of leads me to something that was mentioned by one of the panel members, and that's about how do we best deconflict this sort of interagency competition, given, as I think we heard, that the UN is only as effective as its own member states. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a handful, and I would like to open up for 5 minutes extension, and then opening up for anybody to go first on these questions. Is there any obvious choice in the panel here before I choose? Petra, are you waving to me?
Sure. I don't think I was, but I will go. Do we make it more complex? Well, there's definitely a risk of it. And I think, you know, that all actors work very hard on a do no harm perspective, and, you know, working bottom up, working with a localized agenda. But I definitely think it's a very relevant question that we all should have in mind when we're doing this job. And there were many, I think the second one I would like to respond to: how hard is it to get men to understand in Afghanistan? I mean, patriarchy, it's everywhere. How hard is it to get men to understand in any country what kind of power they have? Obviously very tricky, because we haven't gotten as far as gotten anywhere near the end goal in any country in the world when it comes to the inherent power structures of patriarchy. And adding to that, I think it's not just, you know, it has to do about gender, it has to do in general about power structures in the world. That relates to a number of things, and, you know, as your background, the color of your skin, your religion, you know, there are many power structures that we need to get to grips with. So I definitely would say that men in Afghanistan has a long way to go, but they're not the only one.
Thank you. Michael, you wanted to go next.
Yeah, very briefly. And on the question of dignity, which I feel is a very, and of course, Kanye has spoken to it as well. Clearly, receiving handouts year after year does not become conducive for a feeling of dignity in any way. When the situation in Afghanistan escalated so quickly back in August, I think for many of us traditional donor countries, it became sort of either an eye-opener or the last straw, the last drop, where we sort of said, we need to figure this out. Now we have another country setting where we can't act vis-a-vis the government, thereby releasing the type of volumes that need to be released in a country like Afghanistan. Still very much valuable work being done, of course, but still we know that the basic services need to be there, be it healthcare, be it education, be it food. Otherwise we risk having these, the recurring cycle of violence and extremism and whatnot. And this is the reason why Sweden has actually taken the lead on a project together with a number of other donors and a couple of more academically inclined institutions, and producing a study on exactly this. How do we as donors engage in these contexts moving forward? And clearly we've been trying to solve it with humanitarian, which Kanye also alluded to earlier, with humanitarian means for years and years. And that's not working. It's more or less breaking the humanitarian system and nothing else. So how do we phase in the development actors, and how can we do that at scale? So, I mean, I don't have a reply, but I acknowledge very much your question, and I think you're absolutely right. And it's up to us as donors to find a new middle way of how to engage in those country settings. Finally, on the deconflicting of interagency competition, I don't want to take anything that you might want to say on this, Kanye, but and I'm not going to say this is a Swedish policy per se, but the last 3 years I was at our embassy in Nairobi. And what I can say is my first message to all UN representatives that I met was exactly this. We have zero tolerance for this interagency competition. Just so you know that when you're talking to me, don't come bring that around. And it will be a clear disincentive for funding if we see that taking place. That's how we as donors can be clear with our UN counterparts. And I think be that in a good and friendly way. I mean, a former boss of mine said, Sweden is going to be the best friend UN has ever had, but we're going to be the best critical friend the UN has ever had. So we need to be able to have that frankness between us as a member state, as a donor, with our UN partner. So that's what I think we can do, to be clear.
Thank you. A brief word from you, Per, before I give the final word to Kanye.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I'll be very brief, and I think I'll limit myself actually to providing a good example of the type of leadership that UN leadership that you mentioned earlier, Michael, and that we've all been alluding to. I think I believe in 2020, which wasn't all that long ago, there was actually no joint UN programs in Afghanistan. And now, in early 2022, 17 UN organizations have joined forces to implement the Abade program. So, there are good examples of this leadership and of the team spirit we need to move forward within the UN, and indeed all development actors, practitioners, civil society, as well as donors.
Kanye.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just provide 4 very quick reflections on the collection of very sound reflections. The first is that, I used to earlier on in my career, I would keep this banner on my desk that said, at minimum, do no harm. And then I realized that was just not enough. We have to lean in more. And just thinking, okay, just take each day and do your best is not enough, because we can always do better and we can always do more. And if you take the justice and rights and dignity agenda at the heart of it, doing no harm is not enough. You've got to kind of push further in. The second is I very much agree that the member states, but also I would say each other as a UN system, the best is when there is that honesty and trust to keep us, each other, on track and keeping us from messing things up for those we serve. If you keep that as your goal, then you know when to pull back, when others come in, when to work together, when you do need to go it alone, because you are best placed to go it alone and to be given the space to do so, when to come in on the large joined up work. And I think that is a basic respect that we've got to get better at, and we keep growing in that direction. To me, the value, if at the end of the day, the measure of the reforms is not in often these things that are measurable in these matrices that we all have to fill in, and we have to fill in about 24 of these almost every month. But it's in these issues. Is there more understanding and empathy and trust that allows us to move in and out this way? And I've given some examples. And to my WFP colleague, let me say, for UNDP, when we had a real issue with moving things, not that long ago, but in a different era, in Myanmar, I just had to call my WFP regional director, and he put the entire logistical capability of WFP at my disposal. I'll never forget that. So these are the ways in which we have to step in and out, lean forward, sometimes just let things get done by respecting each other. But there are two things. One is, someone said very early on, and this is very important, maybe it was Petra, none of us here are the first responders. And again, if we keep remembering that, it humbles us. And that is where the agency is. That is where things will change. And that is where in countries today in conflict changed before, and they will change again. So we just have to center ourselves on that hope and belief. And the last issue is that there are a lot of things that science and technology and new financing arrangements are teaching us. And so again, we've got to step outside of our boxes and understand that there are new ways of doing things. If I speak to my young daughters, they think it's very weird the way I work. They've got a very different way of communicating, of engaging, of changing the way money changes hands among Gen Z and the millennials. I mean, this is of a different way in which they engage, the way they engage with social movements, with ideas, with science. This is something I think there's a lot of hope also in that young generation that will take on the charge.
Thank you so much. And I would like to end by appreciating the panel, appreciating participants here, and not least also the organizing teams from UNDP led by Caroline, and from the foundations led by Veronica. I would also like, as a token of our appreciation, to give to all of you the famous speech that the second Secretary General of the UN gave in Oxford in 1968, as he was challenged by the superpowers of the integrity of international leadership. So when we speak about whether 20 years were lost or not, and they were not, we are addressing a leadership that goes across, that endures, that relates sustainability to endurance over the setbacks in order to come back and preserve the normative standards. And what he said in this speech which is about international civil servant in law and in fact, is that he underscored the importance of international cooperation, the international civil service character and independence. And he warned that if these principles were compromised, internationalism would in effect be abandoned, and concluded that the price paid may well be peace. And therefore, I hope you have felt warmly welcome. We have enjoyed all your perspectives in the fabric of the UN as our collective body, we the people, are represented by various organizations and functions. So thank you so much. A warm applause.